Okay, so let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are very thankful for this new week. And in the anniversary of July 18th, Lord, we ask for your Holy Spirit to be here as we look at time setting and the messages that were given in 1999 in that regard. We ask, Lord, for wisdom to understand the things we study. We know that there's many things that we have to learn and many things to unlearn. And we pray, Lord, that you can guide and direct this movement and each of us individually as we study. Be with each person. We know, Lord, that there are many that have been discouraged over the last year, some that have lost their way. And we just ask, Lord, that you can use us to encourage and to gather those who have been scattered. Be with us now in this study, Lord, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning, everyone. Now, this even though we were sort of dealing with another topic, we really were dealing with time setting at the end of last week and even some beginning there. And some of that stuff we're going to obviously look at again. That is, it's connected to this topic. So the Prophetic Time series, which is what Jeff has been dealing with here, we've been going through, and we're now on part 9, though we're going to just go back a bit to part 8. But he's going to address specifically time setting. And there are some interesting concepts that that he brings out, and it's in God's providence the way that things, I believe, were presented by Jeff, because this does really support the position that we took in regard to time setting in 2018 when we began to set dates. So there isn't an inconsistency. It's not as if Jeff spoke against time setting and then we totally disregarded everything he said, or that he even disregarded everything he said. I remember in 2018, in August at the camp meeting in Alberta, when Jeff presented time setting, he really presented his message against time setting. And then showed how we had time in this movement, and that it appeared that we were going to be predicting dates in the future. Now, there was a number of things there that were really interesting. One is one of the first things he presented was Stephen Jameson's understanding of the connection between Pentecost in 31 AD and October 22nd, 1844. But when Jeff presented it, he didn't really present it completely. That is, he had left out the part where we took the number of days of atonement left over and added them to October 22nd, 1844. So that is 1,844 days from October 22nd was November 9th, 1849. Is that correct, Stephen?
Yes.
Yeah. So somehow he missed that. So he could have, if he had presented what you had presented correctly, he could have presented November 9th as a prophetic symbol, but he didn't. Now, later on, of course, Tess presented November 9th. And then that was confirmed by the studies that I had done dealing with Josiah Litch's prophecy, and then also the connections with Ezekiel. And then, of course, from there, came July 18th, and then Stephen had created this structure which connected with November 9th, 1989 to December 25th, 1991, and took those and put them 30 years later to give us this 777 structure. So, I mean, we're all familiar with these things, but the thing that's interesting is how when we look back at 1999 and what Jeff is doing regarding time setting, I actually think he's setting the groundwork for what happened in this movement, because he on the surface may believe that he's speaking against time setting, and he is, but he's also probably unwittingly opening up the door for what's happened in this movement. And so we're going to see that. Now, there's a whole bunch of different points that we're going to have to come back and forth to. Now, we had dealt with, so I'm just looking back at where we were, we had dealt with this idea of God's denominated people and the times of the Gentiles. And there's this statement here, February 15th, 1899, that I think we should take note of, because we were dealing with this fig tree. And with this fig tree, we would say that the fig tree represents God's people, and they're not bearing fruit. Now, Ellen White says in February 15th, 1899, in Signs of the Times, the Gentile world was represented by the leafless, fruitless fig tree. The Gentiles were destitute, as were the Jews, of godliness, but they had not claimed to be in favor with God. They made no boast of exalted spirituality. They were blind in every sense to the ways and works of God. With them, the time for figs was not yet. They were still looking forward to a day which would bring them light and hope. So here we have this statement. Now, what is the context here that Ellen White is talking about? Why would she say the Gentile world was represented by the leafless, figless fig trees? In what context? I know we're not looking at her statement. Before we look at her statement, what do you think she's saying here?
Well, basically, a leafless, fruitless fig tree, I mean, would mean that this is something that is not mature. It's not something that has progressed to the point that it can become what it was supposed to be in creation. So it's an interesting contrast between that and a tree that had many leaves,
Right.
showed signs of being prepared to bear fruit, but didn't bear fruit.
Right. So with the Gentile world, they're leafless and figless, but the church has leaves,
right,
but no figs.
Right.
So somebody just reading that sort of superficially may think that Ellen White's referring to this fig tree and saying that it represents, the Gentile world, but we can see that this does represent the church. The fig tree with leaves but has no fruit.
Right.
So she's then referring to the Gentile world. Now I'm not sure why Jeff shares the quote. That's one of the things that's difficult when we go through his studies, is we're not sure why he's sharing particular quotes. We sort of can infer it based upon all the different quotes put together. But I think this is an important point dealing with the Gentile world, because remember, we were dealing with the times of the Gentiles. And the relationship between the Gentiles and God's church shows up in the 2:25:20s. Would we agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So one's for Judah and one's for Israel. And Israel is typifying the Gentile world, especially when you get to 1798. It's representing Protestantism. That's the false prophet. Because literal northern Israel is scattered, never to be gathered. But the gathering that happens in 1798 is at the end of the times of the Gentiles. And there still are things that we haven't examined thoroughly. Because one is we know it's dealing with northern Israel, which is God's people. And there's this transition that occurs with the 25-20 for northern Israel that I've sort of referred to. But the question is, how does that happen? How does northern Israel become Protestantism? And what does that mean? And we understand that the 70 weeks is connected. Because remember, when we lay this line down of the 70 weeks and the 2/1260s, one thing we can see is that the number of years between the end of the 70 weeks to 1798 is 7 times 252. So that relationship between the 70 weeks and the 25-20 for northern Israel is a mathematical connection. And we could tie that all the way back to the story of Joseph. So, 7 times 252 is 1,764 years. And if we go back from 34 AD, it brings us to the end of that chiasm in the story of Joseph with the death of Jacob. So some very, very profound things that we have found, but I don't know if we've really put them all together, which I think as we go through this study on time, we'll start to see why time in the past and time in the present, why they're connected or how they're connected, and why we had to make the prediction that we did. Because this was based upon, in my view, the reason we did this, the time prediction, was not to predict an event like we thought, but it was actually to tie things together. That is, what we did is we tied ourselves not just to Millerite history by repeating Millerite history, but we also tied ourselves to the time prophecies of the past and tied together all these symbols that Jeff had been bringing out through the years. We tied them all together with that July 18th, 2020 prediction. And Jeff recognized this. Jeff recognized that everything that he had been teaching all came to bear upon that prediction. And that's why he said at one time, if the event doesn't occur, we can't, I can't remember how he said it exactly, but something to the effect that God is the one to blame. I don't think those were his exact words, but that was the intent of it. That God is responsible because everything that God had shown this movement pointed to July 18, 2020. And hopefully as we go through this time setting, we can see this. So just looking at this statement here from February 15th, 1899, if you read through this article, you will see exactly what we talked about, that the ones that had leaves is, on the morrow when we came from they were come from Bethany, he was hungry and seen a fig tree afar off having leaves. He came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet. It was not a common thing in the East for a fig tree to present full foliage so early in the season. It is the nature of the fig tree for the fruit to make its appearance before the leaves. Therefore, upon a tree covered with leaves, one might expect to find well-developed figs. Christ approached the tree, expecting to find fruit upon it, but after searching from the lowest bough to the topmost twig, he found nothing but leaves, and Christ uttered against it a withering curse. So we know that the fig tree is then withered. Peter draws attention to it. And she says, this instance in the ministry of Christ was a singular one, It was unlike his ways and works. We trace his life and see that his acts were ever performed to restore, not to destroy. He scattered mercy wherever he went, in words of counsel and deeds of goodness. He came not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. The disciples could not understand this act in punishing a tree for its barrenness, and they said, "Declare unto us the parable of the fig tree." It was the purpose of Christ that this fig tree should teach his disciples a lesson. He desired to impress upon them the true state of Jerusalem and her final doom. And to do this, he invested the tree with moral qualities and made it the expositor of divine truth. Just before this, Christ had made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. For the second time, he cleansed the temple, driving out from its courts the traffickers, saying, "Take these things hence. It is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves." Dishonest dealing was practiced by men who brought cattle to sell in the temple courts. Now, under the symbol of the blighted tree, Christ presents before his disciples the righteous anger of God in the destruction of Jerusalem. That tree, flaunting its pretentious foliage in the very face of Christ, was a symbol of the Jewish nation, who had been separating from God until, in their pride and apostasy, they had lost their power of discernment and knew not their Redeemer. So there's lots more she says about Israel. And then she's going to say the Gentile world was represented by the leafless, fruitless fig trees. The Gentiles were destitute, as were the Jews, of godliness, but they had not claimed to be in favor with God. They made no boast of exalted spirituality. They were blind in every sense to the ways and works of God. With them, the time for figs was not yet. They were still looking forward to a day which would bring them light and hope. The Jews, as a nation, had laid claim to righteousness above every other people, while they stood in proud defiance of God. So we can see here this contrast, but this is at a point where you're coming to the end of the 70 weeks, and then you're going to have the destruction of Jerusalem. But we can see that the times of the Gentiles is typified by the 70th week, and then the destruction of Jerusalem that follows typifies the end of the world. So we can see this connection between the times of the Gentiles. So we've gone through this already, through the times of the Gentiles, and through this week of Christ, and the work that he's doing for the Jews. So Ellen White bringing these two together, I think, becomes very significant. Now, the other point that we had addressed, and I didn't really complete it last time, has to do with the casting of the figs. And what does that symbolize, or how is that typified? I don't know how to ask the
Falling off the stars.
Okay, right. So you have the falling of the stars in 1833, and that's part of these tokens. That's the third of the tokens. First you have the earthquake, then you have the dark day, and then 25 years later, or 25 years after the earthquake, you're going to have the dark day. And then you're going to have 53 years later, you're going to have the falling of the stars. And the falling of the stars is represented as a fig tree casting its figs. Correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, so what would be the significance then, if we're gonna start looking at this at end time prophecy or time setting in connection with this? Now we have these tokens. So these tokens are going to precede, two of them are going to precede the time of the end itself, and one's going to follow after. So what are they representing? That is, we know that they're tokens. So we know an earthquake is an earthquake, and we know a dark day is a dark day. And we know that this fig tree symbolism that addresses the falling stars is addressing the falling stars. But the question is, what do these represent? The earthquake, the dark day, and the falling stars. Are they just about the tokens or those events, or do they symbolize something else? I mean, what do they mean that they're tokens, for one?
Well, you find at least the first two of them in the chapter called Heralds of the Morning.
Yeah.
So maybe you could,
In the great controversy you're talking about.
yes.
Yeah.
So you could certainly, maybe token would be maybe the same thing as a herald, in a sense, or would that be a distinction?
Okay, so, well, tokens are heralds. That is, they're announcing something that's coming in the future. That's what a herald does. So,
Yeah.
okay.
So we find the dark day also in the plagues. So it's typifying, is it the sixth plague or no, fifth plague, and then we have an earthquake as well being mentioned.
Yeah, so you're talking about the 7 last plagues,
Yes.
right? Because we do also have a dark day in the Egyptian plagues as well.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So so it shows up in the plagues. Now as far as in these prophetic periods, I mean, one is you have a period of darkness that precedes a time of the end. And could we say that the dark day there symbolizes that? That is, we already have a period of darkness. Do we connect that dark day to that period of darkness?
Well, you could do. We don't have really a spirit of prophecy quoted that I can think of that maybe would connect it to, but
No, we don't. Right, and that's why I'm saying, it's a symbol. It's something that we have to look at, and but we do see this period of darkness. Now, what do earthquakes represent?
The French Revolution was described as an earthquake.
Okay. So you're going to have this earthquake. Now, earthquakes also do represent falls of kingdoms. Would we agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So we could say the earthquake that precedes the time of the end is referring to the fall of the kingdom that's in control of that period of time. That would be the papacy. Could we say that?
Don't see why not.
Because these are heralds of what's coming. And so to me, there has to be this connection. Now, then when we go to the figs, or to the falling of the stars, which is represented as a fig tree, what does that mean as a herald?
falling of a church.
Okay,
If you're going to compare a fig tree to a church,
right. So if a fig tree represents a church, and we can use that fig trees are representing, even in the Old Testament, of the church. Okay. Any more thoughts on that?
yeah, and we connect the 1833 and the the 10 years till the 1843 as representing the time of the 10 days before the Day of Atonement, which was the Feast of Trumpets.
Okay, so you're saying that the fig tree, the falling of the stars, is going to represent, there's 10 years, and that's going to be 10 days, which would be from the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, the first day of the 7th month, to the 10th day of the 7th month.
Yes.
Okay.
We should keep in mind also that the tree casts off its figs because of a mighty wind. And wind is a symbol of war and strife and stuff like that.
Right. And so
Trumpets as well.
trumpets as well. What are you saying it mean as well?
Well, you
Trumpets.
have the trumpet powers in Revelation 7 and 9. Sorry, chapter 8 and 9.
Yeah.
So they're like war as well.
Okay. Yeah. So the trumpets and the winds, which is strife. So trumpets announcing war, winds bringing strife or war. But when we look at these as tokens or heralds, we can see that they're announcing events that are going to be coming. They're not the events themselves. They are events, but they're events that are announcing symbolically what's coming, judgment that's coming, and the throwing down of this kingdom, strife, wars, rumors of wars, all those different things that we're familiar with. Now, will these things be fulfilled again? So this is kind of a tricky question, but
Well, we do look for these kinds of things to happen again. Strife, wars, pestilence, earthquake, flood, fire, all of them happening now.
right. So, and we have them symbolized to some degree in, well, we have the dark day in the plagues.
A professor of mine in the past has suggested we think about the crescendo effect. All these things are going, but they haven't reached their crescendo yet.
I don't know what he means.
More intense.
Yeah, I don't know if I would make that kind of application with Bible prophecy. Any other thoughts on this?
That thought would seem to be that what God is doing is of little consequence. And I would have problems with any professor that would have that kind of a comment.
Yeah, I don't think the crescendo thing makes any sense to me, because that's not how prophecy works. I mean, we have repetition. I mean, if you're going to try to use like a musical analogy, I would say, of course, you can have a theme and these themes repeat, right? So that's line upon line. And you can even have, if you want to have wheels within wheels, you could say something like a fugue, where you have those same lines repeat in smaller portions and longer portions, and they are overlapped with each other. But the idea of a crescendo effect, to me, would imply more naturalistic sort of ideas of prophecy, if that makes sense. Just things just become more intense, and then they finally come to the end. And that's not what I see. I mean, maybe in some very limited way you might say that. But, one of the things that I'm bringing up is that people will look at the plagues and the trumpets, and they'll take an Ellen White statement that says, trumpet after trumpet shall sound and vial after vial shall be poured out. And how do people interpret that sentence of Ellen White's? What do they imply? Think it implies?
They use that to place the trumpets into the future.
Right. So they want to put the trumpets into the future. And I think that's kind of what I would get with the crescendo effect, is that people would sort of use that idea. That's the way I think I've seen it used before, not necessarily the word crescendo, but how God does prophecy. Now, so we know that the trumpets are not the plagues, but they have some of the same characteristics. And why is that?
Well, the plagues on Egypt were judgments against their specific gods.
Okay.
So, well, we have the gods represented by Babylon, I guess, will be did in the plagues, 7 last plagues.
Okay, so whether they're judgments against the specific gods or not, I don't think is really the most important thing. To recognize that they're judgments, and so the plagues are judgments, and the trumpets are judgments, right? First against Eastern Rome or Western Rome, then Eastern Rome, and then modern Rome. And if we understand the trumpets correctly, you can't take the trumpets and put them into the future, because the trumpets are progressive, dealing with these 3 different groups that are being judged. But characteristics of the trumpets do exist within the plagues. But that doesn't mean you could take the trumpets and just put them in the future in the time of the plagues, which is what modern Adventism does. They say that the application that was made by the Millerites and early Adventists, by the pioneers, are just sort of, for lack of a better word, hokey kind of rubish interpretations of prophecy. They're not sophisticated like modern scholarship. And so it's really just dismissed more than anything. They don't even really try to address the actual arguments being made, because they're not even on the same level. That is, you can't take Millerite history and Millerite teachings and evaluate them from a modern scholarship point of view, because they're not scholarship, thankfully. What the Millerites did, what the early Adventists did in understanding prophecy, is nothing similar to modern scholarship. And so they can't really answer it. All they can do is dismiss it. But they are destroying prophecy with the way that they make these applications. Now, when we look at Revelation 16 and you look at these plagues, I mean, there's an aspect in which the plagues are literal. So we know that it's going to talk about literal things. But we know that some parts of them definitely are not talking about literal things, like the 3 unclean spirits, like frogs, coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, the 6th plague, because these are symbols. A dragon, the beast, and the false prophet they don't really have a literal mouth, and you couldn't have literal frogs come out of their mouths, but you can as a symbol. And these are going to be things that we're going to look at as we go through this. So I just bring you back to these ideas. And then when we deal with this fig tree, casting her untimely figs. Now, this fig tree has figs. So what does it mean they're untimely figs? Because
Green, unripe.
okay, so how does it relate to the end, like to 1833?
Well, fig trees have unripe figs on them in the early spring, which is still kind of windy weather. March comes in like a lion, goes out like a lamb.
Okay, so, but it's not really helping our question, or not answering the question. So why this symbol in 1833? And then the next thing we're going to see is they haven't departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. So we know that we're not to Revelation 6:14 yet. So there's a fig tree in 1833, or a symbol of a fig tree in 1833, that's going to cast her untimely figs. And this is going to be seen in the stars falling from heaven. So this meteor shower, unlike any meteor shower that is in recorded history, it's going to be symbolized by a fig tree casting her untimely figs. And why is that?
Not ripe yet. Don't have all the information yet.
Okay. So if we look at Millerite history then, I mean, they see this fig tree, this symbol, and they recognize that this is Revelation 6:13. And so they believe Jesus is coming back, because the next one's Revelation 6:14, which is events connected with the second coming. Now, so a fig tree casts her untimely figs when she's shaken of a mighty wind. So a fig tree is not going to normally lose its figs, but if you have a storm, it will, right? So they can be unripe and they can lose its figs because of obviously a very mighty wind. So what is this mighty wind in 1833? What's being spoken of here? Because I think there's something that the Millerites didn't see that they could have seen in Revelation 6:13. Okay, so the fig tree doesn't have ripe figs. What does that mean? We sort of touched on it already.
Not ready to be harvested.
It's not ready to be harvested, right?
And they're immature.
And they're immature. So that means if you had looked at this, they could have taken this and recognized that this is not the end of the world yet, that there's still a work that has to be done by looking at this verse. I mean, there's many other verses that they kept running into that they just didn't recognize, that even though it was pointing to their history, that it wasn't the end of the world in the sense of Jesus wasn't going to come back in 1843 or 1844. But I think when we deal with this idea of the 2520, there has to be this work done first. That is, 1833 is addressing the coming judgment in 1844. But that Day of Atonement is still a period of time. So let's get back to our notes. And I know I spent a bit more time than I wanted to here. Now, we already have looked at Joshua the high priest. But Ellen White's going to say this at the end of this paragraph, talking about this, about the Jewish nation. Maybe I'll read halfway through here. She says, the most solemn responsibility for the Jewish nation was when Jesus was in their midst. It was that generation, the generation which rejected him, that was the guilty one. Jesus speaking sometimes by warning, by judgments, by blessing given and withdrawn, said, "They would none of my counsel, they despised my reproofs. If thou art destroyed, it is thyself alone who art responsible. Ye will not come to me that ye might have life." Warning, expostulation, forbearance, and patience are about to cease. Mark the cursing of the fig tree, representing the Jewish nation, covered with leaves of profession, but no fruit to be found thereon. The curse is pronounced upon the fig tree, which represents the moral, thinking, living agent, cursed of God, living as were the Jews for 40 years after this event, yet dead. Mark the other trees representing the Gentiles. Mark the other trees representing the Gentiles were not covered, they were leafless, making no pretension to having a knowledge of God. Their time of fruit leaving was not yet. Arise, shine, for thy light is come. Now, fruit leaving, now I wonder, is that a typo? Would you say the time of fruit bearing was not yet?
Probably an archaic expression.
Well, I don't think so.
We speak of trees as leafing out, so would leaving be the same thing?
Well, this is fruit leaving.
Is it possible that they're trying to say fruit production?
I think so.
Or is it a more of a reference to the fruit harvest?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it just seems like a very strange expression.
This is pretty cool. I like it when you don't know.
Well, I would think fruit leaving. I mean, I think of the fruit, being cast off. I mean, that's the way I would take this.
As in leave taking? As in leave taking?
Yeah, I don't. Well, I wouldn't put it that way, but.
Were they leaving the movement?
Yeah, I think we're guessing here. So I'm trying to find the statement here. It's in special testimonies. What page is that?
Maybe we should call it brainstorming instead of guessing.
Okay. So where would we find this quote? So special testimonies for ministers and workers. So that's just one of the books, right? I'm trying to find it here. Sometimes it's hard to find. Because that's not.
Is this what we normally call testimonies to ministers?
I don't think so. I don't think it's special. It's testimonies to ministers. That's a different book. I just can't find it here. I mean, maybe it is. No, that's not it. It's not testimonies to ministers.
Okay, special testimony 07. It's from 1897.
Okay, so you found it. Yeah. Have you found it? And what does it say?
I'm looking right now just to see.
So it'll probably be on page 61.
It's page 59.
Okay.
So, all right. The quote is correct. I'm looking at the paragraph that precedes this. Okay, if I read the paragraph that precedes what you've got on the screen, it says, I think it would be very becoming to all who claim to follow Christ to be indeed learning of Christ, his methods, his meekness, his lowliness of heart. We have a decided message to bear. In Jude 1-8, we have the description of the pollution of the world and the working agencies of Satan to corrupt the world. Yet Michael, the archangel, when contending with the devil, disputed about the body of Moses and dared not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke thee. Then it goes into this on Joshua the high priest. So she's giving a pretty good reference there with Zechariah. With Zechariah.
Yeah.
Middle of the paragraph, Jesus speaking, sometimes by warning, by judgments, by blessing given and withdrawn, said, they would none of my counsel, they despised all my reproofs. If thou art destroyed, it is thyself alone who art responsible. Ye come not to me that ye might have life. Warning, expostulation, forbearance, and patience are about to cease. Mark the cursing of the fig tree, representing the Jewish nation, covered with leaves of profession, but no fruit to be found thereon. The curse is pronounced upon the fig tree, which represents the moral, thinking, living agent, cursed of God, living as were the Jews for 40 years after this event, yet dead. Mark the other trees, representing the Gentiles that were not covered. They were leafless, making no pretension to having a knowledge of God, their time of fruit leaving or fruit bearing.
So it says
Was not
fruit bearing?
No, I'm looking at this from context. So if they're describing leafless trees, leafless fig trees at that time were not prepared to bear fruit.
Yeah.
So therefore, if they're not prepared to bear fruit, you cannot harvest fruit from them because they're not producing fruit.
Yeah. It's just weird that she uses this term fruit leading. I can't find anywhere on Google that this exists.
Right.
So either it's a typo, so it should have said fruit bearing, which would make more sense to me. But I think it's interesting that it says
Might
fruit.
want to poke in the 1828 dictionary.
So in the 1828 dictionary,
Might use the same form of diction.
I don't find fruit leaving in it.
Yeah, it's not there at all.
No. So I'm not sure why it says that, right?
Well, in this situation, I think that what's being addressed is that we're going to have to read this in the context that it's presented.
Yeah. But I just think it's interesting that it uses the term fruit leaving in the sense of casting its untimely figs. You know, I just picture the fruit has to leave the tree. It's not time, but I think it must be a typo.
Okay, but there's another point that's of interest as well.
Okay.
The way that she states this, the curse is pronounced upon the fig tree, which represents the moral, thinking, living agent, cursed of God, living as were the Jews for 40 years after this event.
Right.
So in other words, here's a 40-year period.
Mhm.
We were addressing 40 years yesterday in other regards.
Yeah, and this would be an inclusive 40 years.
Okay,
31 AD to 70 AD.
okay. So she's noting the Jews as being the fig tree with no fruit but has plenty of leaves,
Yeah.
and she's noting the Gentiles as being no leaves, no fruit, that they haven't come into maturity according to context.
Mhm.
So the inclusive 40-year period brings us right up to the point of the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
So if this is the case, is this representative of the church today that brings it to the close of probation for the church?
Well, definitely that this is, I mean, this is addressing that, but this is the transition from Jew to Gentile, is what she's addressing.
But is us also giving us the transition from the church to movement?
Yeah. Well, I would think so. Now, when it comes to the times of the Gentiles, so we know that the Protestants, they're going to become part of Babylon. That is, the first horn is going to fall in Millerite history, which is the Protestant horn. And then the second horn is going to fall in our history, which is the church horn or the state, right? So that's going to be, or not the church horn, the state horn, not the church, the state. So that's going to be republicanism, right? So Protestant horn falls in Millerite history, and the Republican horn falls in our history. But when that happens in our history, we also have the joining of the two sticks in our history. That is, in Millerite history, the two sticks are the 225-20s, but they're not going to come together and join properly in Millerite history because Protestantism is going to fall. But then Protestantism is going to unite with Adventism prior to the Sunday law.
I have a study on my website where I note that Protestantism falls in 3 stages as time goes on.
Okay. What are those 3 stages?
I don't remember right now.
Well, definitely they had a partial fall in Millerite history, Ellen White says, but it wasn't a complete fall. And the complete fall happens in our history in connection with the Sunday law. But prior to that, in the image of the beast test, Protestants who recognize what's happening are going to join with those that stand against the papacy, who keep the Sabbath, even if they weren't Sabbath keepers yet. They're going to stand with us at the Sunday law. So
they'll see it as a what shall I say? I don't want to use the term crescendo again, but the pinnacle of restriction of personal civic liberty, civil liberty, as well as religious liberty.
okay.
Was I just talking while I was muted?
No. Not that I know of. Okay. Now, This is, so we have the harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved, Jeremiah 8:20. Now that's referring to the fall harvest, which is the fruit harvest. The enemy that sowed them is the devil, the harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels, Matthew 13:39. And Luke 21:29-33. And he spake to them a parable, behold the fig tree and all trees, right? So we're going to know that about this parable of the fig trees. But it's this part here, this generation shall not pass till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass, but my word shall not pass. Now, how was this interpreted by the Millerites in connection with the fig tree? What did they see when they saw the falling of the stars? How did they interpret that in connection with Luke 21, verse 33? What generation would not pass away according to the Millerites?
Their generation.
Their generation, right? So they believe that this is talking about their generation. Did their generation pass away? We would have to say yes, right? Now,
Unless you're thinking of the generation that curses their father and mother, a type of people.
okay,
We always have those with us.
yeah. So, yeah. But here you have in Luke 21, that Jesus is talking about the generation at his time. Would we agree with that? That generation did not pass away till all these things will be fulfilled. Now, Ellen White said it was 40 years. And typically we look at 40 years as a generation. So could we apply that to what happened in 70 AD when Christ curses the fig tree?
Wouldn't we have to, given what we just read?
Yeah, well, I think we would. We would have to connect the cursing of the fig tree with that generation. So, and as we look at time setting, there are a whole bunch of things that I think people presume or assume things, and they read into texts things that aren't there. And I've seen this text used again and again. This generation shall not pass away, in connection with various types of time setting. Not just in Millerite history, but even afterwards. But we could see in the context, he's talking about that generation, the generation in which he's in, and that was literally true. But it does have a symbolism. And in order to understand that symbolism, I think it's quite important. And we also understand the different generations, like we're in the fourth generation. But people will use this text, and I think they misuse it. That is, they read into it something that it's not saying. So we can definitely apply it in the time of Christ. The destruction of Jerusalem is going to occur with that generation. And so Christ was correct in his prediction about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I'm not sure why Jeff puts this next quote here from 1 Peter 2, verse 4-12. Now, it does talk about a chosen generation, and he underlines it. So I think that Jeff might be applying it to this generation, to the last generation. Though I don't know if I personally would take this this statement in 1 Peter and apply it to what we would generally call a generation. Because in First Peter, when it talks about ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. What is he referring to? What does he mean by a chosen generation?
Could this be a generation that has chosen to accept what the word says? Not predestined, but one that is making the choice for Christ.
Okay. I don't know if I would do that with it. Because I think that this is a reference to something.
I would
Peter's
connect it.
making what's that, Stephen?
Yeah, a reference to the generation that entered the promised land with Joshua.
Right. So this is a reference to the time of Moses, to the Jews being called out, who came out of Egypt and who entered into the promised land, right? That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. So when he's talking about a chosen generation, he's going back to the past. And that generation was this chosen generation. And you are the descendants of that generation. You're a holy nation, a peculiar people. So this is a reference to the Old Testament, not saying that that generation that he's talking to is a chosen generation, as in the sense that we would think of a generation as a period of 40 years and that these people are chosen in that sense. But he's talking about that they're basically the people of God. Right? So he's making a reference to the Old Testament, tying them to the past. That's the way that I would take this. And there's all kinds of biblical references in this statement in First Peter about who these people are. And then he says, dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims. So who are the strangers and pilgrims? What is this a reference to?
The Christians.
Well, this would be a reference to Abraham, would it not, and his descendants?
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. And so he's saying that you are just like those that wandered in the wilderness, and you're going to be called out of this. That is, you're called for a mission. So he says, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. So the whole purpose here of what he's talking about in 1 Peter 2, verse 4 to 12, is that this is, you are the church, right? He says, to whom coming as unto living stones, disallowed, indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. So here he's showing that this church has inherited the aspects that, or the promises that were made to the Jews when God established the Jewish nation. And now the Christian church is taking on that role. That's the way that I read this passage. So again, Jeff is going to choose this passage and underline the word chosen, a chosen generation, to illustrate something that goes back to this last generation. And he has the title, This Generation Shall Not Pass. So I think Jeff is saying the same thing that many people have done, is they take this word generation and they're applying it to the end of the world. Now, and I bring this up because Jeff puts it here, but also he's going to now talk against time setting. Now, if you say that let's say 1989 is the end of or the beginning of the final generation, are you not in a sense time setting? Or are you time setting? I guess is a better question.
Well, it might be construed to be time setting if we say, we acknowledge that we are in the time of the end.
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily time setting, because the time of the end is not a specific period, but a generation is. So if you're going to say this generation shall not pass, some people would go back to Millerite history, back then, and they would say, well, this generation shall not pass away. So we know that we're in the final generation. This is what early Adventists would look at, and they would say, at a certain point, Christ has to come back. Now, as time went on, and all those people who were alive in Millerite history are now dead, they would then have to say, well, we were wrong about that generation being the final generation. You understand what I'm saying? That you're still putting a type of time limit. If you're saying, October 22nd, 1844 marks the final generation, or 1798 marks the final generation. Because at some point, all those people have died. And so anybody who has said, well, that's the final generation, would then have to amend their prediction that generation did not pass away or did pass away. So obviously their time setting was wrong in that sense.
Ellen White seems to say that, I believe it's in Great Controversy or Desire of Ages, one of the other. Also, there's a lot of discussion in some circles in Adventism where she saw a group of people, some were food for worms and some would be transit, and that hasn't happened either.
Yeah, of course,
So people like to argue.
But that's a misuse of that quote, because what she's talking about is not, she's talking about the spiritual condition of that group of people. She's not making a prediction regarding what's going to happen to those individuals.
Right.
That is, some of those people, if based on their spiritual condition, they're going to die. They're not going to be to live without dying, right? So I've never taken that quote as a time prediction on Ellen White's part. It's pretty clear that it's a comment on the spiritual condition of those that she's speaking to. And in a very general sense, to get them to realize their situation. So now this is a quote from Joseph Bates, as you can see. Now he says, when they changed from Philadelphia to the Laodicea state, we believe they influenced hundreds of honest souls to go with them. These are the ones we are trying to seek out by this article, and every other possible way, and show them their perilous and helpless condition and utter destruction if they do not forsake them and turn back immediately to the open door in the Philadelphia church. For there is no promise or hope for them where they are. And so he says, see Revelation 3, verse 16 to 19, which is the message to the Laodiceans. Let us take a general retrospect of the downward progress of the Laodiceans. For 6 successive years, vis-a-vis from the fall of 1844 to the spring and fall of 1850, the most of these leading members have been aiding and assisting each other in changing the chronology, that is, the world's history, to prove that they were on the true position. What have they gained? Answer, nothing but disappointment and confusion. So there's a number of thoughts here that Joseph Bates is bringing out. So one is, he knows that the Philadelphia church is the one that has the open and the shut door, and that's Millerite history. But the church has gone into the Laodicean state. Now he's applying this to who? who are the Laodiceans according to Joseph Bates in 1850?
The first day Adventists.
Yeah, so these would be the Millerites who didn't who didn't accept October 22nd, 1844, at least in that sense. Now, yes, the first day Adventists, but more specifically, those who rejected the midnight cry. And what are these people going to do when they reject the midnight cry? According to Joseph Bates.
They're changing the chronology.
Yeah, they're changing the chronology. That is, they're going to set new dates. And in order to do that, they have to go back and change the chronology. Right? So they're going to change the starting points of the prophetic periods by adjusting the chronology itself. And of course, that's wrong. Right? And they're going to do it, every year, every spring and fall. At least that's the way I take it. So from the fall of 1844 to the spring and fall of 1850. So that's the way that I understand this. He's saying that they're going to keep repeating this. They're going to predict that Jesus is going to come back now. And we see this when we read the history. We see this. Now he says to 1850. Well, we know that in 1851, they also believed Jesus was coming back in the fall. And even for a time, Joseph Bates, prior to 1850, I believe, or prior to 1851, so I think in 1850, he thought that maybe the 7 years might apply, so 1851. But in doing that, he's not going to change the chronology. So at least with Joseph Bates' suggestion that maybe 7 years after October 22nd, 1844, Christ would return, that one seemed like the most logical because you could do it without rejecting the midnight cry. And people within that movement, as Ellen White was saying in early writings, they're going to be predicting that Jesus is coming back in November of 1851. But she says that that's wrong, that the third angel's message must go and it must not hang on time. Time is never going to be a test again. So this is an important point that we have to try to understand in Millerite history what was happening and how we're going to apply that to our history and what we did and what it means. And now we've done it in some ways, but we really want to look at this very closely so that we're well grounded in what we're saying. Because Jeff is going to do this presentation here against time setting. And I made the claim back in 2018 that we weren't time setting. That is, we weren't time setting in contradiction of Ellen White's counsel. Now, Parminder and Tess were teaching something different about time setting. So Parminder and Tess taught we were time setting, but that we were, in a sense, disregarding Ellen White's counsel. Would people agree with me that that's what they were doing?
I won't disagree with you.
Yeah. And Jeff's position was closer to mine, that we weren't time setting. Even though he used the term that we're time setting, he really tried to define what was happening. He tried to show that we weren't time setters, but that we had time in our message. And he didn't really explain it too much, or explain it. I don't think he explained it thoroughly enough because it did create confusion. But part of the confusion was you have Parminder and Tess saying that we are doing time setting. You have somebody like me who says we're not doing time setting. And people sort of with lots of different views in between. And even somebody like Larry Hine, would have argued that we weren't time setting. But later, after July 18th, he said we were. So some people thought we were doing double speak, that we were, but I was being very specific what I meant, because I showed how Ellen White specifically opposed time setting, and that we would have to oppose time setting in anything connected with the second coming of Christ. But yet that time existed within this movement. And my view is that it primarily was internal. And the question that I had is, could we take the time that we had in our movement and apply it to external events? Now, one of the things we're going to examine as we go through this is I really want to go back and examine, even though I've done it in other places, what happened in November of 2018. Because in November of 2018, Heidi and I, in coming across Ellen White's visions of the Civil War, we made a prediction. At least we had a date, and that date was November 22nd. And we wanted to know what that date meant. And the basic reason I wanted to know what it meant is because it appeared to give a date that we could test our theory about whether we could predict external events or not. And now, very interesting stuff happened in connection with that, which we will get to in the future. How that was opposed, I'll show you the documents, what was said. But that was buried. So it's a very interesting story of how that was buried. Even a year later, and Stephen was there when this was presented again, when I went to Arkansas on November 9th, I was there and presented 273. And then on November 10th, we had a study. I did 3 studies where I had to present my study on November 22nd, 2018. And that was recorded, but never was released. That is, they wouldn't release those presentations. And it was just a small group, but they did record them, but they wouldn't release them. And there was no explanation why they wouldn't release them, why they didn't want to put them out. But I think it's part of what ended up happening later is connected to that. So it's going
This is what you're referring to is what they called the Thanksgiving presentation.
right.
And that, since I was there in front of Larry later, a couple of years later, I mean, he was being extremely agitated, extremely blunt on this situation, yet when asked specifics, he couldn't give you a specific reason. It's just that, well, this is what we're told. And I'm going, wait a minute. Why are you now the arbiter of what's truth and what isn't? Aren't we supposed to examine what's going on? And aren't we supposed to address it directly? I mean, if there's a problem, fine. Shouldn't we understand that regardless? But if it's truth, shouldn't it be out in people's hands?
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is the point, because I really think that in this movement right now, there still is confusion about time setting. I mean, there are people who think because we have dates in the future that we're time setting. At least they have questions about that. Why do you have these dates in the future? People will ask me, do you think something's going to happen on December 25th, 2021? Are we expecting an event? And so since that confusion exists, I think it's important that we look at time setting. Now, what happened yesterday, I do want to illustrate this. So before we really get deeply into this, as we're going to do this week, I want to go back over what we noticed yesterday. So I'm going to go to the whiteboard, and we only have about 10 minutes, but that's probably enough time. So, I already have it written out, so that maybe helps a bit. But usually, I just wrote it up for Heidi yesterday because she wanted to understand this. Now, when we deal with this 777 days, we know that this actually goes to 1989 and 1991, right? That's where this comes from. But we've also applied it 30 years later to November 9th, 2019 and December 25th, 2021. Now we know November 9th as a date becomes extremely significant because, as we discussed, from October 22, 1844 to November 9th, 1849 is 1844 days. So prior to Stephen knowing anything about Tess's November 9th prediction, he had used the number of days from Pentecost to October 22nd, 1844, and found that it was a period of 1844 years of 359 days. That is, he took out the prophetic, out of a prophetic year, he took the days of atonement out. And then from October 22nd, 1844. So he's going to go from when Christ begins in the holy place, right? So you got Pentecost in 31 AD. And this is the holy place. And then this is going to be the most holy place. Now, of course, we know that Christ didn't end his most holy place ministration on November 9th, 1849. But maybe he could have. Maybe that could have been a close of probation. I don't know. But this is what Stephen did. But he came to this November 9th date. Now, this November 9th date already had a meaning for this movement, right? So prior to anything Testa had done, we already had November 9th as a date because we had November 9th, 1989. But then we could, with the work that Tess did, which I think is a bunch of faulty reasoning, she then gives us November 9th, 2019. But this date, we've already inferred it, that is, Stephen has already inferred it, based upon the 30 years, right? So you're going to take these 30 years and you're going to put it into the future. So even if Tess had never presented anything, we still would have had November 9th, 2019. But we also would have had December 25th, 2021. That is, we would take these 777 days and we could have done this. Now, once we had November 9th, we came up with July 18th. Now, again, this was first based upon Ezekiel and then upon Josiah Litch's prophecy. Josiah Litch's prophecy had confirmed November 9th along with Ezekiel. And this period of 252 days, as soon as I had this July 18th date, Stephen Jameson emailed me and said, it's 252 days. So I shared that with Jeff, and this became very profound. We didn't know about this 525, and Stephen, you would have figured this out sometime later. Do you remember when you took the 777 days from this history of 1989 to 1991 and then put it into our line? This was after July 18th, or was it before?
That was from a study around March, around March 2019.
Okay, so it wasn't until March that you then took this. Now, had you noticed the 777 days in this history first, like before that, or is that just in March that you started to look at this period of time?
Yeah, I think it worked out. It was probably be around 2018 that I seen that the 777 days connected with the fall of the Soviet Union.
Okay. But it took you till not till March of 2019 to then see that you could create this inversion of these numbers.
Yes.
Right. Now, the other division that we have of these numbers was something that came from the 70-week prophecy. That is, in the 70-week prophecy, I'd used the two Lamechs. And I had recognized that if I multiplied the beginning and the end, that is the 7 weeks at the beginning times the 7 weeks at the end, that I would get 343 years. So 7 times 7 times 7 equals 343. And in the 70 weeks, the center weeks are 434. And that if you added them together, you get 777. So that is simply the 70 weeks have a structure where if you multiply this, the 7 times 7 at the beginning with the 7 at the end, and then you add it to the number of years in the middle of that, you get 777. And so we could then take this period of time and prior to the event, so that is we have here January 16th, 2021, and this is 434 days, and this is 343 days. So a brother from Vietnam put this together quite a long time before and thought, why can't we do this division? Now we know that ended up being part of that structure with the 10 days of prayer from January 6th, the 187 days from July, and this is going to be July 4th, with these 100 days at the beginning, starting March 27th. So this division became significant. But what we noticed yesterday then, and the way I started thinking about it is what the number of weeks here is 36 weeks, right? 7 times 36 is 252.
Yeah.
And what Dwight had pointed out is that since July 18th, this was 52 weeks. And so then I realized that this is 88 weeks altogether. Right? Now, of course, 88 weeks is 616 days, which is another inversion because there's actually 3 possible ones of taking 777 days and dividing it where you get this inversion. So July 17th marks that point in which you get this inversion. So we have 3 of them. And we can see that they're all connected symbolically. Now, anybody know the number of days from here to here?
The number of days from where to where?
January 16th, 2021 to July 17th, 2021. Okay, Dwight, does this number look familiar?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you presented this number with the 65,
Right. 14
180.
times 13. Yep.
Yeah, the 187 and the 182. So the fact that we can take these structures and that we can find this number that you were talking about in this structure, I think is also significant. So you weren't thinking about this and this when you were talking about the 182, but it's in the story of Lamech. And of course, Lamech is connected to the 777.
Right.
Also I use the story of the two Lamechs, the 70 times 7 and the 777 years, to give us these two numbers. So you can see that this is all a structure that fits together. Now, so we now then, it's 160 days to December 25th, 2021. But we can see that this is in God's providence, that this time that exists is not something that we've manufactured. It exists in the beginning of our history. Our movement is tied up with time. But we still take the position that we are not time setters. And that when we made the prediction of July 18th, I didn't make that prediction based upon being time setting. That is, all I did is I confirmed this date as being connected to Josiah Litch's prophecy, and to Ezekiel's, and that this date is also produced, and that we couldn't just ignore it. Now, we connected it to Nashville in lots of different ways, and I think that was valid. And I do believe that Nashville could have been hit by a nuclear attack on July 18th, 2020, if we hadn't given the warning. But I think we had to give that warning. It seems to me that we can look at the story of Jonah and we can tie it to this prediction for this movement. And we have to believe the story of Jonah illustrates this. Yep.
I can't see any other way except to tie it to the story of Jonah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the point right now, Jonah is in one way does represent the mindset of the church, because he was given a message that needed to go to Nineveh, but he chose not to give that message. He was disobedient.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the church chose not to give the message to Nashville and hid it for almost 115 years.
Mm-hmm.
Then when we, along with Elder Jeff, gave this message, the attitude becomes that Jeff was a false prophet, which he was not, because it was Ellen White that gave the original message.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're discovering right now, what we're uncovering all the way through, is the fact that this was a message that God had wanted to see given, had not given, but wanted in this way to test whether or not we were willing to follow God regardless of what the outcome was.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And the other thing that comes from this is, so prior to December 6th, there was this suggestion that we need to remove this date, that we were time setting when we looked at December 25th, 2021 as a future date. But of course, there's no way that we could do that. That is, I couldn't say, well, this is not part of our line. That was a mistake. I couldn't say that. But that was basically a demand that we remove that. That was Bronwyn who said we need to remove that date. And that if you put that date there, you're time setting. Now, I still say that we're not predicting an event on that date. And I've always said that. Now, we did talk about it being the Sunday law, but I was always really clear that that was just the end of our line, and that the Sunday law comes after that, and that it could come the next day, December 26th, because that will be a Sunday. But I said, we don't know, and we can't know, because we can't predict the date of the Sunday law. That was my view, and it's still my view, that we can't know what date the Sunday law is going to occur. But we can say that this is about this movement, and these are all internal lines, and that December 25th, 2021, by being the end of a period, just like November 9th, Nothing really happened on November 9th, but we can say that this marks the division in this movement between the Omega and the Alpha. But that this whole line continues to show that division. And that's happening still with internally in this movement. Now, I'm not going to say that after December 25th, everybody who's left in the movement then will continue to be in the movement and be part of the 144,000 or anything like that. I don't think that we can mark that type of thing. Let him that is righteous be righteous still. But I can say that those who have rejected light, we have this short time in which those people have to accept this light. And that would include people in this movement who haven't really accepted this light. And there was this suggestion, which I really do want to address, regarding the statement made about chronology, and that we have medical missionary work and also the third angel's message that are part of our message, not just chronology. But never has there been a suggestion that our message is just about chronology. And never have you just seen us only presenting chronology. Have we talked about the third angel's message in our studies?
Quite a bit.
Yes, and very in depth. And when it comes to the medical missionary work, I mean, this is a work, it's not so much a message that we give, but it's a work that we're going to do and that we have to be prepared to do. Now, part of the problem there, from my perspective, this is my view, because I've been in the medical missionary work for over 30 years. I was trained in it. And that much of what we call the medical missionary work now, much of what we call the health message, I say is just New Age counterfeits of the health message. That it's not the message that Ellen White gave regarding health, or it's not the work that we're to do. We're to use hydrotherapy. We're to use herbs, simple treatments, and we're also to point people to the laws of health, to the 8 doctors, as a means to stave off illness and as something that needs to be followed in order for that person to be better. That is, there isn't some magic herb that you can take that can undo all of your bad health practices. There isn't some miracle drug or chemical that's going to make up for the fact that you aren't exercising, that you aren't drinking pure water, that you aren't breathing fresh air, that you aren't spending time in the sunshine, that you're not exercising, doing physical work outside, that you're not taking time in personal study and prayer, that you're eating foods that are unhealthful, that God forbids us to eat, and also overeating. All of these different things. There is no magic formula that can make up for the fact that you're transgressing God's laws. And part of our work is to educate correctly about the laws of health, not to teach us about New Age ideas about health and the new miracle food or the new miracle herb or whatever it is that's going to get rid of imaginary problems that are really connected to New Age science and have nothing to do with anything biblical. So I think that we have a problem in this movement in that we think that the medical missionary work and the third angel's message and chronology are separate things. And what I said yesterday is that when we frame that discussion is, well, we don't just teach chronology, we should be teaching these other things. First, it gives the impression we're not teaching these other things. But second, it puts people at odds with each other. And it puts these messages at odds with each other. Instead, we should see them all harmonized. That is, we can't look at any of this as some separate thing. So it's something that I really believe that we need to address in this movement, and I believe it has to be addressed by December 25th, but it has to be addressed not by some organization, but by each of us individually. That is, we need to examine what it is we believe, what we believe about chronology, what we believe about the third angel's message, and what we believe about our role and our work and what true medical missionary work is. And sure, we can do presentations on it, but if people individually are not studying these things, they're not going to be prepared, and they're going to be on the wrong side of the issue, the wrong side of the message. Right? That's my view. That's where I think we're at, which is why I think we have to spend time studying this regarding time setting. That it's not just some thing that we're studying. We just happen to be studying because we're on this in Jeff's notebook 1. I think God in his providence has brought us here. And we're now at a crossroads. This movement is in a crisis. And some people have tried to say we're not. But I think to anybody who was there yesterday, I think we have to realize we are in a crisis. And I don't think everybody's aware of what this crisis is. But I think God called us to this, to recognize this crisis. And each one of us is in a very precarious position right now. Would people agree with me?
Most definitely.
Will yesterday's session be posted on YouTube somewhere?
Yep, it's posted on my page. And also, we also have Toby's messages have been posted on my page as well as Iran's page. And so these are the messages prior to December 6th. And these are definitely pertinent for us to look at with our present situation. So sorry I went over time, but let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for your providence, for the way that you have led in our lives. As we look back upon our personal walk with you, Lord, we can see your hand, but we can also sense, Lord, that we have not always followed your leading, that we have rebellious hearts, that we're proud, we're selfish and stubborn. And we're no different than those that have left the movement. We're no different than those that made the declaration on December 6th. We're no different than Parminder, those that follow Parminder and Tess. That we are all dependent upon you, and that we are foolish and we've gone out of the way. We ask, Lord, for forgiveness, and that we can renew our walk with you each day. We ask, Lord, that this work that you've promised to do in this movement cannot be lost because of our rebelliousness, because of our stubbornness, because of our pride, but that this work will be accomplished in us by Christ, and that this mission, this call to the Seventh-day Adventist Church to prepare for the Sunday law will be completed. We know, Lord, that souls hang in the balance, and that we have failed many times to do the task in front of us. We have not reproved sin. We've condoned it by our own actions, by participating in sin and rebellion. And Lord, so we just ask that the thing that has to be done, that the third prayer of Jonah will be realized in our lives, and that we can give the message of warning that you have been preparing us to give. We pray and we thank you and we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.